Well, it is good to be here. And I mean specifically in this building because out there it's cold. I was born in Minnesota, but then my family wisened up and we moved to Florida after a few moves to other places in the world. But truly it is good to be here. If you're going to be here all weekend, every session is going to be a little bit different, but I want to tell you where we're going. The theme of the weekend, title if you will, is Let God Write Your Story. And what we're going to be doing tonight is we're going to be talking about a mission story. This is not a story that my family wrote. This is a story that God has been writing for many years now. And then tomorrow morning, I think it's 10 a.m., we're going to be talking about His story, the Great Commission, how that intertwines and why we as Christ followers need to be participating in the Great Commission. Tomorrow evening, I believe again at 7, we're going to be talking about the story continues. You know, when any good author writes a story, they don't write the whole story in one chapter. So we're going to be talking about the following chapters of this story that God began writing many years ago. And then Sunday morning, we're going to be talking about the full story, bringing all these components together in one session. Now, I need to show you a picture so that you get to know a little bit about me. If you would put that first picture up. So this is my family. I have 6 daughters. My wife and I have been married for 26 plus years now. Our oldest daughter, there on the left, she's standing there with her husband. So we're starting to add boys to the family, hopefully very slowly. Our youngest daughters are twins. They're 15 years old, and tonight they're actually babysitting at our next door neighbors. But people oftentimes ask me, Jaime, you travel a lot. And I do. I think this is my 4th or 5th country this year, since January. And they say, so why do you travel so much? And I show them a picture like that, and they don't ask any more questions. They completely understand. Just to round out the family, we do have 2 dogs. Both are female. So I'm greatly outnumbered in my house. Another picture I'd like to show you now is my parents. My dad, about closing in on 12 years ago, had a significant spinal cord injury. He started the ministry. You'll hear a little bit about him tonight. And then my mom. My mom is kind of the glue that holds all of us together. But we're all readers in our family. And my mom, when she reads a book, especially like a John Grisham book or something with a little bit of suspense, she'll read the first chapter, then she skips to the last chapter. That way she doesn't need to worry about how the story ends. And you know, when we start talking about missions and the Great Commission, that's what God's done for us in this book. We know how the story ends. So we don't have to worry about all the chapters that God wants to write. The end has already been written. If you'd show the next picture now, these are my grandparents, Nate and Marge Saint, my aunt Kathy, and then my dad Steve. Their 3rd child, a son, Uncle Phil, he is not there. You can actually just leave this picture up until pretty much we're done tonight, so that you can just kind of picture the people of this story. Missions. It's been said that God desires worshipers from all people groups. God desires worshipers from every people group in this world. Ralph Winter, one of the authors of Perspectives, said this: missions exists because worship doesn't. The purpose of missions is to be able to give people the opportunity to become worshipers of God. The mission story I'm going to tell you tonight is about a group of people that believes what the Bible says is true, that in the last day, as we read tonight in Revelation chapter 5, it's also in Revelation chapter 7, that in the last days, there will be people from every nation, kindred, and people group standing before God's throne, willingly giving Him praise. But we know, how are people going to hear unless somebody goes? Because faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God in Romans chapter 10. The story tonight begins in the 1950s. My grandfather Nate was a missionary pilot serving other missionaries who were living in the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador, South America. Now, if you don't know what that is, if you go down there, you would be very afraid because they have trees. And if they came up here, they would be very afraid because of all this white stuff that you have. It's very different, but yet people all have the same need, and that is the need of Christ. So as he would be flying over the Amazon rainforest, taking missionaries out to their missionary stations or flying supplies and mail out to them, there was one territory that no other pilots would fly over because of the people that lived there. At that time, it was known as the Alca territory because nobody had ever gotten close enough to these people to know what they called themselves. Their tribal name is Waodani. Now, I'm going to help you to say that together because people always, when they try to say this name, they get it wrong. They mess it up. They butcher it completely. So if you ever happen to be down there, you'll know how to say it properly. And so I want you to see, you have a friend, and the friend's name is Donnie. Say Donnie. Okay, and Donnie does something amazing, and you say, wow, Donnie. So do that. You got it. Nobody had ever gotten close enough to these people group to know what they called themselves, which you now know is Waodani. But my grandfather would fly over this territory. Now these are the foothills of the Andes. There are ridges, so if you're flying just a short distance off, you may not see a clearing where some of these folks lived. But in order for you to understand the story that I'm going to share with you tonight, you need to understand the people themselves. The Waodani were an egalitarian society, which means everybody is equal. There's nobody that's higher, there's no chief, there's no laws. Everybody does whatever they want to do, whenever they want to do it. But there did become 4 unwritten rules that everybody lived by. And they went something like this. Rule number 1, if somebody does something that offends you, ignore it. Rule number 2, if somebody does something that offends you and you can't ignore it, kill them. Rule number 3, if somebody kills somebody in your family group, it's not only your right, it's your obligation to kill somebody in their family group. And finally, rule number 4, whether you've been offended or to avenge a death in your family group, you're going to kill somebody in another family group, take your whole family group with you, kill the whole other family group. That way there's nobody left to kill you or your family. They were a society of death. Anthropologists who have since studied this tribe said that there was a 60% homicide rate inside the tribe. They called them the most violent society to have ever existed on this planet that's been studied. But my grandfather knew that there would be people from that tribal group one day before God's throne. So he put a group of men together. These were missionaries who were living in the Amazon. Those who their common place of contact was my grandfather and his airplane, as well as my grandparents' house on the edge of the Amazon in a little town called Shell, named after the oil company airstrip there. And these 5 men, along with my grandfather Nate, were Jim Elliott, Roger Darian, Pete Fleming, and Ed McCauley. Young men. My grandfather was the oldest at 32 years old. Pete Fleming, the youngest, at the age of 27. All of them were married, all but one had children. So they wanted a way to be able to show this group, after my grandfather had located a clearing on the edge of the Iwainguno or Kururai River, they wanted a way to demonstrate that they were friendly. My grandfather, years before, had designed what we called the bucket drop, where he would fly his little PA-14 Piper family cruiser with 1,200 feet of line with a bucket tied to the end coming out of the back of the airplane. And he would fly about 500 feet above the ground in very tight circles, and as he was flying, the bucket would work in the opposite way of the airplane until it would hang motionless below the airplane. As he let out more line, the line would go straight down, and for 13 weeks at the end of 1955, they began giving gifts to the Waodani people. Well, it wasn't long before the Waodani began giving gifts back. In fact, they built a platform on which to receive the bucket. My grandfather was giving gifts like pots and pans, machetes, things that they could only get by killing people from other tribes in other areas of the jungle. They gave gifts like a comb, a feathered headdress made from a toucan. You guys know the toucan? You have Fruit Loops up here? Okay, it's that bird. Even the live parrot, which became my dad's pet. I've met the man who they took that pet from. His name was Pa. He's now with the Lord, but he always wondered. He said they probably just ate it. But that became my dad's pet. They even sent things like roasted monkey meat. Now, have any of you had roasted monkey meat? Nobody? You have. Okay, you can't answer this. Do you want to know what it tastes like? What do you think? You would think chicken, right? It doesn't. It does taste very similar to toucan, though. At the end of 13 weeks, my grandfather decided it was time to make contact, and I want to read from his journal. It's from the book End of the Spear, which is the full story from the 1950s all the way up to the 1990s. You'll hear more about that tomorrow. This is from my grandfather's journals. These books are back there. You're welcome to take a book. There's 2 books. One I'm talking about tonight. One I'll be talking about tomorrow morning. They are free to you. You're welcome to leave a donation if you'd like. The only thing is, if you're going to take a book, whether you leave a donation or not, you have to promise to read the book. Okay? Otherwise, leave it, and somebody else will take it. This, again, my grandfather's journal is in Christmas of 1955. He says this: as we have a high old time this Christmas, may we who know Christ hear the cry of the damned as they hurtle headlong into the Christless night without ever a chance. Would that we could comprehend the lot of these Stone Age people who live in mortal fear of ambush on the jungle trail. Those to whom the bark of a gun means sudden, mysterious death. Those who think all men in all the world are killers like themselves. If God would grant us the vision, the word sacrifice would disappear from our lips and thoughts. We would hate the things that seem now so dear to us. Our lives would suddenly be too short. We would despise time-robbing distractions and charge the enemy with all our energies in the name of Christ. May God help us to judge ourselves by the comprehension of May God help us to judge ourselves by the eternities that separate the outcomes from a comprehension of Christmas. And him who, though he was rich, yet for our sakes became poor, so that we might, through his poverty, be made rich. In early January 1956, my grandfather had found a beach on the edge of the Kururai River, 2 ridges over from where the clearing of the Waodani were. It was about 600 feet long. That's a little bit less than 200 meters for you that deal with meters. Do you deal meters or feet? Yeah, neither and both? Okay. About 200 meters long. Are there any pilots in the room? None? I am a pilot, and 600 feet is like landing on a postage stamp. It was right after a turn in the river. Just a quick note on that. In the movie End of the Spear, how many of you have seen that? Two things. One, that movie is 2 chapters of this book, and my dad was the stunt pilot in the movie, and in the movie the beach was only 400 feet long. So he found this beach and he began ferrying the men in. They had prefabricated a treehouse to protect themselves from wild animals. Every evening my grandfather would fly the plane out to Arahuno, which was a different tribe but very close by, because overnight, based on river or rain that happens upriver, the rivers will rise 3 or 4 feet. And if your plane is now covered in water, it doesn't fly very well. Every morning he would fly back in with Pete Fleming, who was the lightest of the 5. And they waited. On Friday, January 6th, after being there for several days, out of the jungles came 2 young ladies and a young man. There was no animosity, there was no hostility of any kind. They spent the day there together on the beach. Nankiwi, they had nicknamed him George, but Nankiwi was fascinated with my grandfather's airplane. He went over to the airplane that they called the yellow wood-bee, because it makes the sound of a wood-bee that lives in the Amazon, along with a lot of other large and dangerous animals and things. And so my grandfather gave him a ride in his airplane. He flew him the 2 ridges over to where the clearing, where their longhouse was, where that family group lived, and then flew him back to the beach. But Nankiwi wouldn't get out of the airplane because, much like you or me, he didn't want to see his village from the air. He wanted them to see him. If you or me, if we get a new car, which working in ministry we don't, although that's pretty nice. You know, if you get a new car, you really don't care who you see when you're driving that car. You do care who sees you. And so flying back over their to their clearing, Nankiwi started stepping out on the strut of the airplane so they could see him. Being a pilot, I can only imagine what was going through my grandfather's head. You know, I need to get him back in the airplane, but what do you grab? Their jungle attire was very easy to keep clean because it wasn't very big. It consisted of strings that went around their waist. Fortunately, they made it back in the airplane and they made it back to the beach safely. Late that afternoon, Nankiwi and the younger of the 2 ladies left. The older of the 2 ladies, who was probably in her late 20s or maybe even early 30s, which was very old at that time by tribal standards, left just before dawn. These men were excited. God had given them the first friendly contact in recorded history with this tribe. They knew the next chapter, that God was going to allow them to share His love and His goodness with this people who so desperately needed it. Saturday came, there was no contact. Sunday came, still no contact. So my grandfather, in the early afternoon, flew over the 2 ridges to where their clearing was, didn't see anybody, and as he was flying back, he saw down as they were crossing the river, because you can't see through the Amazon because there's multiple layers of canopy. But as they were crossing the river, they were heading to the beach. So he called my grandmother, Marge, who was always standing by on the radio, and said, "Marge, it looks like they'll be here for the afternoon service. I'll call you again at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock came and there was no contact. As my grandfather's watch had stopped shortly after 3 o'clock, as his body, having been pierced with multiple spears, had been thrown into the river. All 5 men dead. The story went around the world on shortwave radio and in Time Life magazine. What a tragedy. How could these men who were just being obedient to what God had told them to do, how could he allow them to be killed? You know, one of the verses that we probably don't quote a lot in the Bible is 2 Timothy 3:12. It says, and it is a promise that says, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall live happily ever after. No, it doesn't say that. It says, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It's not a maybe, it says all shall. It's a promise. But in God's economy, when God writes a story, he takes what we think is a tragedy and he turns it into a triumph. Romans 8:28 says, all. Right? What does it say? You guys probably know this one. Because it's, what? What does it say? Yeah. How many things? All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. You know, when we look back, we can see the story that God was writing. But at the time, it can seem like a tragedy, but God turns it into triumph. If I was to combine those 2 verses along with the theme of the weekend, I would say it would go something like this. God has a story to write with your life, Christ follower. He doesn't promise that every chapter is going to be easy. In fact, if you allow him to write your story, there's going to be some difficult chapters. But if you allow him to write your story his way, he promises to make sense of even the most difficult chapters before the story comes to an end. That was not the end of this story. That was just the end of one difficult chapter of the story. 2 years later, the next chapter began as my great Aunt Rachel, Nate's sister, and Elizabeth Elliott were invited in to live with the tribe. My grandmother, or my great aunt, had been living with Dayuma, a young lady who had fled from the tribe from all the killings years before. They thought that the foreigners, who were cannibals in their mind, had just eaten her. Well, she went back in and then invited Aunt Rachel and Elizabeth Elliott to move in. 2 years after Aunt Rachel moved in, Elizabeth Elliott moved out. Aunt Rachel spent her time discipling Dayuma. She would teach Dayuma. Dayuma would then teach the people. Being with Wycliffe Bible translators, she helped to develop a written language for the tribe, and then helped to develop or to translate the New Testament, which was dedicated in 1992. My family, we'd been down there many times. I don't know of a time where this tribe was not family to me. Maybe later I'll tell you, if I think of it, I'll tell you my full name, including my tribal name. But I want to read just a little excerpt about Aunt Rachel, because I think there's not much known about her. And she says this, talking to my dad. She says, Stevie boy, when I came to serve the Lord, I really didn't have much to offer him. That may be where you and I are tonight. Well, what do we have to offer? Then she went through a list of things she didn't have. I was never much of a linguist. And of course, that's a big deal, the linguistic work. I was pretty old when I came down to work with the Waodani. I couldn't teach and preach nearly as well as other people. I was no theologian. And she went on and on. And so my dad asked her, what do you think it was that the Lord honored in you? And she thought for a moment and she said, well, I loved the Lord with all my heart, and I trusted him completely. And I was willing to obey him because I trusted that He wanted me to do what I was doing, and it was best for me if I did it. And then she paused a little bit and said, I guess I just learned to persevere. I just learned to keep on going with whatever He gave me to do. And then my dad, as he reflected on that, said this: when an ordinary man or woman commits their life to Christ, God does uncanny, supernatural things with them. That's the story about Rachel. 2 years after my great aunt moved in, my dad got to go in for the first time. He was about 9 years old. And at the age of 9, he was about as tall as the tallest members of the tribe. A short time after being in the tribe, Minkai, the man who killed my grandfather. Now, those of you who have seen, this is just a little time out, those of you who have seen End of the Spear, the character in the movie is Minkayani, not Minkai. They had Minkayani. Minkai and Ani is a suffix which means and the people. They had to tell the whole story through one character. So when you see the movie, they show the reconciliation at the end of the movie. Minkayani and my dad, that is a different character. That's not Minkai. It's somebody from the tribe told through the character of Minkayani. Okay? All right, now we're back in. So Minkai had come to Aunt Rachel a short time after my dad had moved into to spend summers and all the time that he could with the tribe. And he went to Aunt Rachel and he said, Nemo. That name is her tribal name. It means star. Nemo, how can Bobad, my dad's name, which means wild, how can he be this old and yet not know how to live? And Aunt Rachel turned to Minkai and said, Minkai, you haven't killed his father. Who do you say should teach him how to live? And Minkai left to think about that. If you remember, there's 4 unwritten rules that they live by. If Minkai teaches my dad how to live, how to hunt and how to track, how to use a blowgun and how to use a spear, he was giving him the tools and the training necessary to come and kill Minkai or members of Minkai's family to avenge his dad's death. Minkai came back that afternoon and he said, it's true. Having spear killed his father, I myself will teach him how to live. You see, in the jungle, they say there's 2 trails. There's your trail and there's God's trail. Minkai was no longer walking his own trail. He was walking God's trail. And so my dad was actually adopted by Minkai, the man who killed his dad. And that was not known until later when Minkai, his son, said, Baba, let's go hunt monkey. Because monkey, there's not a lot of meat, but it is pretty good if you get the right parts of it. And my dad said, well, I don't have a blowgun. They said, oh, just take Minkai's blowgun. Now, Rachel had told my dad, you never touch a warrior's blowgun or his spears. A blowgun takes about a month to make. Spears take a little bit less time, but it was a killing offense if anybody but a warrior's sons would touch his blowgun or his spears. Well, my dad looked into their longhouse and he didn't see Minkai or Minkai's wife Ompore. And so he grabbed the blowgun, the kapok, the dart holder, and they went monkey hunting. Well, when they came back, he looked in, and Minkai and his wife Ompore were both in the longhouse. And he was thinking about sneaking it in, but the blowguns are about 10 feet long, so you don't exactly sneak that into a house with no walls. He took it in, and he knew he was going to get it. Minkai saw him and didn't say anything, and it was at that time that my dad realized that he had adopted him as his own son. Well, fast forward the story to 1994. In 1994, Aunt Rachel had died of cancer. I believe it was November, and my dad went down for the funeral. And after the funeral, the people through Dawa, who would be kind of like a tribal aunt or grandmother to my dad, came to my dad and said, Baba, now that Nemo is dead, we say that you, being part of our family, you come with your family and you live with us. And my dad said no. And she, not missing too many moments there, she said, well, Nemo said that you would come. Now, if you ever had known my Aunt Rachel, you knew better than to argue with her when she was alive, and now they just put her body in the ground. And so you knew you weren't going to win now. And so my dad used what you or I might use in church today. He said, I'll pray about it. You know, Pastor Shay comes and says, man, there's a new ministry for you, and you would just be perfect to run it, and you don't want to do it. You can't say no because he's the pastor. So you say, I'll pray about it. Well, Dawa, turning back to the people, said, people, in Yunani, people, having already spoken to Wangongi, the Creator God, I know that he sees it well. Surely they will come. My dad, thinking equally fast on his feet, said, people, speaking to Wangongi and Onginkamo. Now, he knew that they could talk to God, the Creator. But he knew even if there was a way to communicate from the Amazon, 60 miles out in the rainforest, to north central Florida, to talk to my mom, they didn't speak the same language. So he knew it was safe. But Dharma, turning back to the people, said, people, Onginkamo being a Christ follower, if God sees it well, how can she not? So in 1995, 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, we moved down to live with the Waodani people. And we said, people, what do you want us to do? Because missionaries do things. And they said, no, we don't want you to do. Foreigners are always coming and they're doing for us. They come and take care of our medical problems. They come and take care of our dental problems. They will even fly us out in an emergency. But they said there's two problems. Now, these two problems will lead into what I'm going to talk about tomorrow night. But these two problems are this. Problem number one, foreigners only come when it's convenient for them, not when we have a problem. And two, when they come, they can only meet a physical need, but our people have a bigger need. They have a spiritual need. So they said, if you will teach us what foreigners know how to do, we will not only be here when there's a problem, but as we take care of the physical need, we'll tell them how Jesus can fix our heart. One of my favorite memories was in 2005. Minkai had been up with my dad and me. We would speak in different places promoting the movie, End of the Spear. And we were taking Minkai back to the Amazon. And it was about September, August, September of 2005. And I reflected back as my dad was sitting up in the pilot seat. Minkai was back in the third row and I was in the middle row. And I realized, 50 years ago, my grandfather was flying over these very same jungles looking for the people I now call family. And here I was, his son, who was 5 when his dad was killed, sitting in front of me. The man who killed him, who I call grandfather, sitting behind me. I told you I was going to tell you, my full name is Jaime Nate Minkai Saint. Named for my mom's dad, Jim, so Jaime, which is the Spanish name and the Spanish spelling. Named for my grandfather, Nate, my dad's dad, and named for Minkai, my third grandfather. So as I end tonight, I want to tell you this. I want to share one more story. A story of my grandmother. My dad's mom, as she was her second husband, who was a widower that she married 10 or so years after my grandfather was killed. Her second husband had died about a year and a half prior to this, and She was just on her last legs. That morning she had gone into the hospital to have 6 liters of fluid drained from her abdomen. She had cancer, I believe, for the 3rd time. And my uncle and my aunt had asked my dad to just make a short video of her testimony. And she didn't have much energy, but she there sitting in what is now Chris's home. It was my home. I bought it for my parents, and now Chris, who you'll hear from a little bit tomorrow morning and tomorrow night, that's his home now. And she was sitting there, and she said, when I was a young nurse, I heard that there was a real missionary coming to our town. And she said, as soon as I got off my shift, I ran as fast as I could to the church. The only room that was left was in the 2nd balcony. And while I heard this missionary lady speak, and then she gave an invitation to who of us would be willing to give their lives to serve the Lord. She said, before I knew what was going on, I was down at the altar, and she said, your will for my life at any cost. And she said, I had no idea what it would cost me. I lost my first husband very prematurely. Had 3 young children to bring up. I've had cancer. I married a 2nd husband who is now dead as well. She went on and on of all the challenges that she had faced on the mission field. And she said, but if I could go back today, and I had it to do all over again, knowing all the things that has happened, she said, I would still say, your will for my life at any cost. Church, if we are willing to say, God, you write my story any way you want to write it, it's going to cost. But this life that we live is just a vapor. It's here and then it's gone. It's been said, and I may get this wrong. I'm not going to say it because I will get it wrong. But it's something that ends with, whatever we do for Christ will last. This life is short. Are you willing to say, your will, God, for my life at any cost? Tomorrow morning we're going to be talking about his story, the Great Commission. He is a good God. He doesn't just offer to write our story. He wants to be the author and the finisher of our faith. He is worthy of our lives to allow him to write our story.